Thank you very much indeed for that overly kind introduction. And I'd like to thank you very much indeed for asking me to give a response to a most wonderful address that we've just heard. It is a great honour for me that you asked me to do this. I'd like to congratulate you on what you and this hall work for, and I'd like to congratulate Bishop Vincent Long Van Nieuwen in particular, not only for his appointment, but for the views that he's expressed to us tonight. While I'm billed as giving a response, what he has said needs no response. It's clear, it's unequivocal, and I really hope that the full text is sent to every member of Parliament. I would like to think that all... I would like to think that all of you, inspired by Bishop Vincent's speech, might contact your members of Parliament in the next day or two, because they're going to vote on a most wretched piece of legislation which ought to be put into the trash can. The High Court's decision should be upheld and asylum seekers should be processed on Australian shores. I've been asked to try and put today's position into a little historical perspective. A lot of our history we applaud. The parts that are not so fine, we tend to push aside. And some of the things that happened in the early days, by today's standards, are certainly not good. At the foundation of this nation, not much over 100 years ago, the Constitution was plainly racist in many respects. The Aboriginals in South Australia had the vote. Before Federation, they lost the vote, as did all others on Federation. They weren't counted as people amongst the population of the states. They were not regarded as people. Leading politicians of the time said it was necessary for the Commonwealth to have laws, to make special laws for the control of people regarded as inferior. It was a racist constitution in many respects. Some parts of this were undone in a referendum in 1967, but other parts still remain and are beginning to be debated today, but much needs to be changed. More recent attempts to redress some of the wrongs in relation to Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders still fail because the results or the approaches are paternal. Canberra works out what ought to be done, and consultation consists of persuading different communities that what Canberra has determined is good for them. And that approach will never work. If you're going to try and help a community, they need to have some ownership of what is being proposed. And the way to do that is to consult and together to devise an approach. But nobody so far has had the patience to do that as they should. You know, the old arguments, we can't even agree in our own history in Australia because people were taken away from their families because they were not full-bloods. It was believed that full-blood Aboriginals would die out because they had weaker genes. The Aboriginal Protector of Queensland in 1928 proposed to other Aboriginal protectors from the other states, no, I want to provide some services. I want to help the full-blood Aboriginal communities in Queensland. And the other Aboriginal protectors, what a wonderful name it is, protector. You might have said dictator or whatever. Tyrant, perhaps. But the others prevented him from doing so. And that was that kind of Australia. But it wasn't only in relation to that. When what Hitler was doing to the Jewish communities in Germany was becoming very evident, the French organized a meeting at Evian in 1938. There's an Australian representative, Thomas White, a minister in the Australian government. And he said, Australia would love to help, but we can't. We have no racism in Australia and have no intention of importing it. That was 1938. You can Google it and get the records. The words he might have used would have been a little more elegant than the ones I did. But the words I used expressed his precise meaning. I think very few of us know that when the League of Nations was being formed, Japan wanted a preamble that would the preamble couldn't, but would clearly state that the League would be against discrimination on the basis of race or religion. And who do you think did most, more than any other single individual, to prevent that happening? Prime Minister Billy Hughes of Australia. A conference was organized to try and find words that might be acceptable to everyone. Hughes said he wouldn't go to that conference because they do not understand, he said. It's not the words that are our fault, but the underlying idea of equality that is so repugnant and offensive. Now that's part of Australia that you won't find in a school book. Many of you will probably know of the role that Archbishop Mannix played in this country. I think it was a great role. He became one of Australia's greatest citizens and contributed much over the best part of half a century. But he said at some point, as reported in a Melbourne suburban newspaper, that he was against conscription. Not because he was against the German war, but because he believed it would make an unequal commitment even more unequal. And the commitment that Prime Minister Billy Hughes had made with the British was that we would keep 5 frontline divisions in the trenches, fully manned. The British said, don't worry about the logistics, the support staff, that's all boring stuff, we'll look after that for you. So the Australians were all in the meat grinder, and our casualties for our numbers were higher than anyone else's. And volunteerism wasn't keeping up with the numbers being killed. And Billy Hughes had said, as he probably wished he hadn't, but he'd committed himself not to bring in conscription without a referendum. And because of his attitude, Bishop Mannix was opposed to conscription. And I believe he was right, because he knew it would make an unequal commitment even more unequal. There were 2 referendums. I'm told in the first referendum he obeyed the bishop hierarchy and didn't enter the debates. But in the second debate, he did enter the fray, because Billy Hughes had turned the debate. He said when he saw what Mannix had said about being against conscription but not against the war, he said, if I turn this into an anti-Catholic, anti-Irish debate, I'll win. And so he did. And Bishop Mannix defended himself and defended the church. And twice, Billy Hughes failed to win the convention. Now, there would probably have always been some sectarianism in Australia because of the tensions between Ireland and Britain. But there is no doubt that whatever Billy Hughes said during those debates exacerbated the sectarian tensions in this country and brought them to a fever pitch. If there hadn't been a settlement of the Irish question in 1922, I believe it could have led to armed conflict between Catholic and Protestant. My father was in France for the full time of the First War, and he and other people serving in France believed what Billy Hughes said. You know, Catholics aren't Australians, they owe their allegiance to the Pope. All sorts of things. Some of the professions wouldn't allow Catholics to join the profession. So an unusual or a larger number than might have expected joined the Commonwealth public servant, where such discrimination was not possible. That became a papal plot to take over the Commonwealth from the back door. These arguments didn't start to die till the 1950s. And state aid and other measures helped to earn the death. Now, the point of that is that when sectarian, religious, or racial arguments arise, they can cause so much damage within a community that it takes many, many decades for them to be put aside. In 1946, Arthur Corwin introduced the Great Migration Program, a quite remarkable effort. 600,000 servicemen and women waiting to be demobilized. Memories of 20% or even 30% unemployment from the Great Depression still present in many people's minds. Many Australians' first job was with the Australian Army as it went overseas. That was the only job they'd ever known. So how was it possible to bring in the largest migration program in Australian history? We all knew that if we did not expand, build the resources of this country, that it would be vulnerable, it would not be defensible, it would not be safe. Unlike the United States, Japanese bombs did land on Australian territory, and the war came very close to us. And Australians realized that much had to be done, much had to change. So when the migration program came in, it had the full support of all political parties. Public bodies were established to help maintain public support in case racist rednecks started to say something about Italians or Greeks or people from Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union itself, as they came here in their tens upon tens of thousands. And the most migrants or refugees who came did not come from Britain. The pressure to get out of Europe was so great that most came from different parts of Europe at that time. And many had a very difficult time in the early years. But if there were tensions, Australian politicians of all persuasions sought to ease those tensions. No politician played politics with race or religion, and if they had, that great migration probably would not have been possible. And so it went on through the 50s, 60s, 70s. Gough Whitlam initially made a decision to not accept refugees from Indochina, apart from one particular boat or plane load of children. When I reversed that, he did not oppose it. So the policy remained bipartisan so far as the federal parliament was concerned. And that, I think, was critical to its success. The ending of the White Australia policy wasn't a sudden occurrence. It didn't happen like a hot knife going through butter. It happened little by little and quietly. People in Canberra knew it was happening. The first significant step was signing on to the Refugee Convention in 1954 under the Menzies government. Then little by little, some of the provisions of the White Australia policy were modified or changed. Hubert Opperman made a speech in Parliament when Harold Holt was Prime Minister, which virtually ended any practical impact for the White Australia policy. Gough Whitlam got rid of the legal remnants, but it had no practical impact in 1972. And it was that gentle whittling away of the policy that enabled it to be killed. If somebody had got up, even in the 1950s, and said, we're going to end the White Australia policy, there would have been people coming out from under the woodwork, and there would have been bitter and divisive arguments. But that was avoided because of the way the issue was handled. And it was all those earlier decisions that really made it so much easier to say in 1976, there are going to be a great number of people fleeing from Vietnam, and we will take as many as we can. There were 3 years in a row when the humanitarian intake, when Australia was a much smaller country than it is now, when over 22,000 humanitarian intake came into this country year by year. I think about 70,000 in all from Vietnam alone, leading to a community now of what, 240, 250,000 in total, with family reunion and business migration. And we didn't need razor wire camps. People were in communities. They were out billeted with other people. They could go and buy a cup of coffee, they could get work, they could get some assistance. I can remember speaking to people who were received in homes in Adelaide. There were toys waiting for the kids or clothes waiting for the children when they arrived. But again, that was happening because politicians did not play politics with race or religion, with people fleeing terror, people, the most vulnerable people in the world, people who would have died if they'd stayed at home and risked death through the boats and the danger of the boats. And I think Australia, well, we all know Australia is so much a better country. If there are people left who long for the old, narrow, inward-looking Anglo-Saxon Celtic Australia, they've only got to walk up and down any street in any of the major cities of Australia and know that that time is long past. We're not that country anymore. We're a different country. Except our politicians tend to behave as though they're not a different country. Recent polls have shown that over half the numbers of Australians polled believe there should be onshore processing of asylum seekers, of boat people. Now, if one of them, and I think that's a remarkable tribute to Australians against the rhetoric, the allegations and the abuse that boat people have had from both political parties, both major parties. And if one of the major parties said, right, there must be onshore processing, it is the only humane, decent thing to do, it is the only ethical thing to do, it's the only way we can fulfill our obligations under the Refugee Convention, which we committed ourselves to more than half a century ago, then that number of a bit over 50% would probably be well over 70%. But our politicians don't seem to see it that way. And why not? A government facing defeat decided to turn the boats back. Tampa happened, children overboard happened, and that resonated around the world and did so much damage to this country. I can remember visiting Harvard, Kennedy School, shortly after this, and the Australian students there said to me, how long do we have to, can we have a private meeting? We don't want Americans around. One question only, how long do we have to pretend we are not Australian as a consequence of those actions? I'd had people speaking to me from Latvia, from Cyprus, from Finland, and obviously from people closer, much, much closer to Australia. The Chinese premier, this was after I was out of Parliament, of course. And so these things were noticed, and they've done Australia great damage around the world. And the current debates have been noticed also and do Australia great damage. They are demeaning to the Australian people. They are demeaning to the people. The Prime Minister made a speech the other day, and if she hadn't been a woman, I would have thought it was the last Liberal Prime Minister, John Howard, making a speech. The words would have fitted, and the sentiments would have fitted. How has this come about? Somehow politicians have begun to believe that they'll win votes in acting the way they do. Well, it is up to all of us somehow to persuade them that they're going to lose votes, they have lost respect, and a great deal is going to happen before they regain the kind of respect that I think and hope people had in some earlier times. We need to ask ourselves and remind ourselves, as the Bishop has, who we are, what we want, the kind of generosity and humanity that Australians generally show, and if given a lead, will be enormously compassionate and enormously helpful to those in need. And what are the choices to people fleeing if their government is a tyranny, if a father has been killed, if an uncle is in jail, or if a mother has been brutalized? You can't go along to that regime and say, please give me a piece of paper, I want to flee your wretched regime. So you travel without papers very often, as the Refugee Convention recognized. I met one member of an Afghani family, husband, wife, and 2 girls. 5 years educated illegally by a female professor, no longer allowed to work, but smuggled into the home, small house, probably fit on the stage. And then as the girls got older, they thought this is too dangerous, and their tradition starting to be, perhaps, when the Taliban were there, of marriageable age, and they wanted to do something better for their girls. Over the border into Pakistan, join a camp 2 million long, hope somebody will tap you on the shoulder 5 or 6 years' time, maybe a place you don't know where, or try and get on a boat. They had a small business. What was it worth? What was the house worth? Not enough money to get on a boat to Europe, where out of Middle East and South Asia at that time, 400,000 a year asylum seekers were traveling, 4,000 or 5,000 to Australia. They did have enough money to try and get on a boat to Australia. They got caught into Port Hedland. A refugee advocate got them out. 4 years in an English, or in a school in Sydney, don't know whether public or private. And I met one of the girls, and she was 17 and a half at this time. She spoke good English, doing a higher school certificate. What do you want to do? I want to be a doctor. My people need doctors. I said, you'll need high marks. She said, that won't be a problem. And I checked afterwards, it wasn't. Such people are going to make wonderful Australians, wonderful citizens of any country. The kind of thing that so many thousands of Vietnamese have already done by their commitment and dedication to work and determination to build a better world. And why cannot these things be understood by people who go to Canberra? Bishop Vincent, thank you very much for your address. It's a powerful and beautifully expressed address, and I really hope it will inspire all of us, not just people in this room, but you've all got friends who aren't here. You've all got others who those friends know. And it's going to be people, the people of Australia, who change what's happening in Canberra. And the kind of leadership that the Bishop has shown us is the kind of leadership that will lead to that change. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.